So our next panel is titled Ensuring Community Well-Being in the Search and Recovery of Missing Children. It'll be facilitated by Don Worm, who is a bit of a latecomer. We don't have a bio, so just a quick introduction for Don. He's a Cree lawyer from Kawastoos First Nation, Treaty 4, Saskatchewan, is one of the leading advocates in the province for human rights, criminal law, and treaty litigation, as well as being a senior partner in Samaganus Worm Legal. I'll turn it over to Don, who's going to facilitate this panel and facilitate the dialogue with you after the panel is done. Don.
Well, thank you very much, Terry, for that kind introduction. The panel today is the Indigenous Archives panel, and it is a facilitated panel, and I guess I'm your facilitator. Hey, where's my Saskatchewan peeps at? Come on, show me some love over here. There you are. How about the rest of you from the prairies? All right. Ontario and East. Wow. North. All right. Anyhow, it's lovely to be here, and I am honored to be the facilitator for this panel. You will have in your conference packages the full biographies of each of the speakers, and you will see that in this one, under the 1 p.m. time slot, which we are crack on, we have Raymond Frogner, who is the head archivist at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and he is seated at my far right-hand side. We have in the conference brochure Krista McCracken, Research Curator for Shingwauk Residential School Center, Algoma University. That is not Krista McCracken. Filling in for her is Ed Sadowski, who is with the Children of Shingwauk Alumni Association, and Edward has very kindly agreed to fill in for Krista, who unfortunately had taken ill and couldn't be here with us. But Edward was the research director at the Shingwauk Residential School Center, and he was instrumental, in fact, in bringing Krista to that center to run that. So I think he'll be very well placed to provide the information for today's panel. The last in the conference document, and actually the first speaker, will be Kristen Kozar. She is the Interim Executive Director at the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center at the University of British Columbia. We will know that she is, Kozar is her married name, she tells me, and that she is one of the Wilsons that populate up and down the West Coast. Many of you will know her and probably are related, in fact. This morning we had some very emotional as well as some difficult conversations, and some questions were raised about where we at in terms of data sovereignty. What is data sovereignty? Who controls this? And how do we get access to it? Our speakers today will assist us in understanding some of that, at least in terms of the work that they are doing in Indian residential school research. Each of them control archives. They are known as Indigenous archives. What makes them Indigenous? Is it the fact that they are populated by Indigenous people, or that the subject matter is comprised of Indigenous people, Indigenous facts, and so on? Those are the questions that need to be asked, and let's call upon Krista Kozar as our first speaker. Please welcome Krista Kozar.
Hello. Please just give me a moment. So hello, everyone. I am truly humbled and honored to speak to all of you today. I would like to extend my gratitude to Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples whose unceded traditional and ancestral lands we meet on today, and the same lands that they have stewarded since time immemorial. Prior to beginning my presentation, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Kristen Kozar, and I am the daughter of Rocky Wilson, granddaughter of Rose Cook and Andrew Wilson, whose real name was Cluxton. I am first and foremost a proud member of the Halitsim First Nation, and I'm also an intergenerational survivor of residential schools, as some of my ancestors went to Cooper Island and Cheam Indian School. I came to this work in memory of my ancestors who are no longer with us, but also for my aunties and uncles who are still here, and to make the steps necessary for a better world for my children and eventually my grandchildren. I'm currently the interim executive director at the UBC Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center. I have my master's in library and information studies, and my research interest is in Indigenous data sovereignty. Further, I have the honor of co-leading the oral testimony program at the center, and I must note that speaking at this event today has brought a huge mix of emotions for myself, because I'm not only professionally invested, but also personally because of my family history at residential schools. Now it's not working. Thank you. This slide provides a brief outline of the presentation. I will start by grounding information on where I work and on the importance of this topic before delving into Indigenous data sovereignty. Our specific mandate at the center is to address the colonial histories and ongoing impacts of residential schools and other colonial policies imposed by the Canadian government on Indigenous peoples, and to promote acknowledgement, examination, and understanding. Much of this work we do includes facilitating dialogues and enhancing access to records and information that support and engaging these historical harms and the continuing impacts of colonialism in Canada. Further, we also have the oral testimony program that ensures the experiences of those who attended and were directly affected by residential schools and other institutions and systems of colonialism are recorded, preserved, and made accessible for future use. The benefit of this program is any access or holding of these recordings will be made in accordance to individual and/or community stipulations, not our own. We are building this archive and education space using trauma-informed theories and practices and trying to approach our work with the humility and respect that it well deserves. We think about how we look at records in order to be more survivor-centered, and we are providing the proper health and cultural supports and generally remaining culturally agile when walking alongside diverse communities and individual experiences. To encompass this, we have a close partnership with the Indian Residential School Survivors Society, many of whom you'll see today in the green shirts. I'm going to speak briefly about the actual records themselves. Many of the records pertaining to Indigenous peoples are written or textual, and many of these would be, as we know, older records originally created by the government and churches. We also have oral records, especially important here being those oral truths provided by the survivors themselves. Many of these can be more recent in origin, coming out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission activities, the various redress processes, and smaller individual testimony gatherings. Now to speak of archives regarding the residential school context, one of the biggest holders of records is the federal government of Canada, primarily through Library and Archives Canada. Further, as Raymond will note, the NCTR also simultaneously holds many of the records provided by the government and various church entities. They also hold the testimonies collected by the TRC, as well as sacred and material objects, art, poems, and music, and other media. And then further, you have the university-located archives, like ourselves at UBC, and the Shingwak Residential School Centre at Algoma University in Ontario, as well as other provincial, local, community, and specialized archives and repositories. So it's important to give an overview of some of the main frameworks around records that we operate under, as well as the complexity involved when all these pieces have to interact with one another. As I believe most of us know, residential school records, like many other records, are bound to general, provincial, and federal standards and legislation around privacy and access. However, at the Centre, as a survivor-centered organization, we strongly view our lead in this area as coming from survivors and from Indigenous communities and organizations. In this regard, there are various emerging Indigenous data sovereignty models around records and data, such as the First Nations principles of OCAP, which is ownership, control, access, and possession, which can provide guidance. And another aspect is the TRC's calls to action document, especially those calls aimed at archival practice and international models. So those are calls 67 to 70. The ability to create collective memory and collective identity is directly linked to confronting and interpreting a community's own past. Collective memory can include not only written records, but also oral traditions, public commemorations, artifacts, etc. Oral history and written records often exist in a complementary relationship. And without access to both forms of this, a community is left with only partial versions of its own history and identity. The growing presence of Indigenous perspectives and historical interpretation is reflected in communities that are establishing their own archives and traditional archival institutions, turning to communities for assistance in description and cultural protocols surrounding Indigenous heritage. As we know, Indigenous peoples have an intimate relationship with and deep connection to their information, knowledge, and data, particularly traditional and sacred knowledge that has been passed down from one generation to the next. It is from this premise that Indigenous communities are accountable to their own citizens and to those that they serve for the use and management of community information. This authority is based on the inherent right and treaty rights supported by international instruments such as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP. In regards to the Canadian government promising to make all residential school records available, Chief Judy Wilson said, "We need to have the truth before we can have healing." Residential school records and data of any sort regarding Indigenous peoples have mostly remained out of reach. Knowing the full extent of residential schools through records is absolutely required to have truth and reconciliation. I am of the opinion that truth needs to happen first, prior to any reconciliation. Turning now to control and ownership of records, I would like to note that the definition of data sovereignty means managing information in a way that is consistent with the laws, practices, and customs of the nation-state in which it is located. Indigenous peoples in this country have an inherent and constitutionally protected right to self-government. As sovereign nations, First Nations in this country have the inherent right to exercise authority over their own data and their information. The concept of data sovereignty is linked with Indigenous peoples' right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions, as well as their right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their intellectual property over these. Data sovereignty is an absolute crucial step towards moving into full self-governance for Indigenous peoples, but also to have full reconciliation. The Canadian government and First Nations are both considered sovereign, and I would suggest that it is required to work towards recognizing this in this country to make steps forward. In 2015, Chief Justice Murray Sinclair stated, "Reconciliation is not an Aboriginal problem. It involves all of us." Reconciliation is about addressing past wrongs done to Indigenous peoples and making amends and improving relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to create a better future for us all. Again, for this to happen, records access is necessary to know the full truth of residential schools and the events that happened there. With stating that, I would like to note that we have worked within a colonial system that collected data for us and about Indigenous people in this country, often for the implementation of policy that actually worked against us. And so in order to rectify this when it comes to Indigenous data sovereignty and to make things right with Indigenous people in this country, my suggestion would be to deconstruct these policies and walk alongside each other to create policies where both inherent rights can be looked upon and move forward in a good way. Okay. When I talk about this issue of access to records, this has a number of meanings and layers within this context. When thinking of concepts of access, there's a strong power dynamic involved. The power of control to control historical and contemporary narrative by controlling who is accessed, when and where they have access, and what they have access to. This speaks to the colonial frameworks that Indigenous peoples have been forced to fit into for centuries, and as per UNDRIP, this needs to change. It is fortunate that we have a body like the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation that can act as coordinating Indigenous-centric repositories for copies and originals of many valuable school records. And the creation of this archive and accumulation of records to populate it is not something that happened overnight. The settlement agreement laid down that the TRC's mandate was to access all relevant records. The Commission had to go through court cases against the government in order to push its definition of relevant, highlighting the danger of using ambiguous language in formal agreements of this kind. The government had argued that the only records that were relevant to the work of the TRC were the ones relating to policy and operations. They essentially argued that the names of the children, the years they attended, the schools each individual attended, and the statements of those children were not relevant to understanding the history of residential schools and its legacy. Fortunately, the TRC was able to legally enforce much of its definition and subsequently transferred to the NCTR a large collection of important records. There are certainly issues here in regard to the large scale and complexity of the records involved, as well as some of the policy and legislative impacts on the sharing of these records. That is something that should have been properly addressed given the length of time we are now involved in. There's also a strong general policy privacy element involved with these records, some but not all being publicly available, especially those that contain identifying and sensitive information. Other issues with access are that sometimes records can be public but very hard to locate and search through. There are large dumps of records that have not been cataloged at the individual level and or not easily located and searchable. As we know, because of this, survivors and communities continue to experience delays in accessing records and in getting the full range of records possible. In my opinion, this is unacceptable. When we think of the contemporary urgencies communities are dealing with today regarding unmarked graves, I would suggest that legislation pertaining to Indigenous records and data needs to be deconstructed and rebuilt rather than having a Band-Aid approach. On behalf of the Centre, we recognize the importance of closing the gap between communities and government entities when it comes to the access of records and ultimately Indigenous data sovereignty and governance. We are currently working with the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation and with the Royal BC Museum on a number of projects so we may do our small part in this endeavor. These include developing thorough research guides for communities to better access their records, hosting a webinar to walk through the components necessary for recording oral truth, and in the near future, hosting an information session on the relationship between residential schools and Indian hospitals. We are also working on a Digital Museums Canada exhibition regarding Indian hospitals in BC and working with community to share the history of these institutions as well. I pondered last night about Honorable Stephen Point's speech yesterday. It really stuck with me. The injustices Indigenous communities and individuals have endured with purposeful malice from colonial institutions. At the Centre, what I can say is we are doing all we can to support Indigenous data sovereignty and governance and linking records back to communities. But I personally often feel like it's not enough. As Honorable Stephen Point referred to yesterday, it has been too long Indigenous people have been unseen. In Canada, it's imperative the federal and provincial governments walk alongside communities for the purpose of Indigenous data sovereignty and governance. Talk just isn't enough anymore. The federal and provincial legislation needs to sit at the table and to honor the inherent rights that First Nation communities have. The gaps are critical. Historical data collected on Indigenous peoples was for the purpose of colonial policy making and for the intentional harm and subjugating of Indigenous people in this country. It hasn't been for Indigenous people. Though a large ask, the legislation and policy framework has to be deconstructed and reconstructed. This time, the sovereign right of Indigenous people needs to be incorporated, and they need to have an equal footing. We look towards a future of more inclusive dialogue on this issue, increased transparency, further access to records, and increased primacy of survivor voice in the records. And I'm going to get the boot soon, voice in the records and historical narrative and legacy. In order for this to happen, significant changes at the federal and provincial level need to happen. So I raise my hands to you and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that, Krista. We will be having a decent opportunity for the conference participants to be able to speak directly to the panelists right after this. So I'd ask you to hold your questions for Krista Kozar and for our next speaker, and that is Edward Sadowski, and as well as for Mr. Frogner when he finishes speaking. So we'll open the floor after that to hear from you. So I know you have all kinds of questions that hopefully the panel will be able to answer for you or be able to provide you with some information as to how to deal with that. So without further ado, Edward, please.
Hi, everyone. About 24 hours ago, I was not expecting to do this, so please bear with me. And in the last 24 hours, I've been in contact with my colleagues back in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, the survivors, and they've asked me to say a few words on their behalf. Firstly, on behalf of the Children of Shinwak Alumni Association, they wish to acknowledge the survivors that are present here and their families, and also the three First Nations whose territory that we're currently on. Irene Barbeau, the president of the Alumni Association, sends her greetings. However, Irene has been in a hospital for the last little while and she just returned home. And she's going to be turning 80 this year, and the stress of dealing with issues regarding the site search at the Shinwalk and Waywanish residential schools has affected her health. So in the interim, Jade Jones, who is the son of Susie and Vernon Jones, who are at the Shinwalk School, has taken over as the interim president, and he sends his greetings as well. Now, since you do not have a bio in front of you, I'll just give you a brief indication of who I am. I used to be the adjunct professor at Algoma University, which is located on the site of the former Shinwalk Residential School. The building is still there. It forms part of the main campus of the university. And I was also the research coordinator for the Shinwalk Residential School and Archives Center. Since that I left in about 10 years ago, I've been working on other projects and working with survivors on other issues. Mike Kakaji, who was at 3 residential schools, I've been working on him on a number of files, and unfortunately, Mike is suffering serious health issues as well. And I'm not sure if it was you, Marie, or Kimberly that alluded to the fact about survivors. We believe that Mike is the last survivor that went to the St. John's Residential School in Chapleau. So Mike is 84, so and he's suffering from cancer. So the time is getting close to what you alluded to earlier in your comments. I've also been working closely with Harvey Trudeau and the people who went to the Spanish and Wikwemicon residential schools, and he sends his greetings as well. I've also been involved with Anishinaabe-Aski Nation, Sam Ashni Benishkum, and his residential school unit. We work closely with gathering records for all of the residential schools that were in the Treaty 9 territory. Also, the National Residential Schools Survivor Society, Ted Cuisance, who is here. I work closely with him and Mike on promoting or lobbying on behalf of survivors during the time of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. Ray Mason, worked with him. He was on the NARS board, and also he was the lead in pushing for the Indian Day School Settlement Agreement. Saul Day, Larry Henry, and Ruth Beardy. I was involved with them regarding the Fort William Indian Hospital Sanatorium School. We filed a legal challenge under the settlement agreement to recognize that school as a residential school, but unfortunately, because of missing documents and the Canada's use of contract law of the settlement agreement, we failed in that regard. Hopefully the 4 law firms that are currently working on the Indian hospital class action will get their act together and finally come to some sort of a settlement with Canada, and hopefully they'll stop fighting amongst themselves regarding compensation. Hopefully that they will take up Kimberly's offer of supplying a written submission for your final report. Lori Meyer-Dries, she was involved in the Indian Hospital Schools issue, and she was here yesterday, and I'm glad that she was able to be here, and she will also be providing you with a submission regarding Indian hospitals, so look forward to that. Reginald Percival, I congratulate Reginald because we were involved along with Lawrence Baxter in the students who were boarded out. We understand that they have an agreement in principle and that we work closely with Reginald. I am hoping to see Reginald here while he's in BC. I lost contact with him since he left his home in the Nisga'a Nation to come to Vancouver for health reasons. So, hi Reginald, if you're here in Vancouver. Now, at the center, our focus was on missing children and destroyed documents. The government destroyed a lot of documents, and this came out as a result of the survivors telling us during the early time of the settlement agreement that they were not eligible for compensation because there were no documents to show that they were at an Indian residential school. The advanced payment program, over 3,400 survivors did not get compensation because Canada could not prove that they were at a residential school. And we found out that most of the records, quarterly returns that were the primary documents, were destroyed prior to 1941 for many residential schools across Canada. Now, the one odd thing about that regarding destroyed records and survivors is that the two class actions that led to the settlement agreement, the Baxter case and the Cloud case, dealing with the Mohawk Institute, one of the lead plaintiffs in the Baxter case, Mr. Baxter Sr., was denied compensation because there were no records to prove that he was at the Pelican Lake School, even though the judge said, yes, okay, certified the class action, but Canada denied his compensation. He applied for the common experience payment. Sorry, no records. You're not getting any money, even though Justice Perel and the other administrative justices used that class action to help certify or set up the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. So there's that issue with destroyed records. Now, at the Shinwalk Residential School Center regarding sovereignty, when we established the center, the alumni, the former students, controlled the archives. It was their archive. They provided photographs, documents, and working with the Anishinaabe Nation and other organizations of Spanish residential school survivors, we managed to collect information all across Ontario and Quebec. And so the archive is actually controlled by the children of Shinwalk. And they're housed at Algoma University under a number of agreements that included the National Residential School Survivors Society. So that is what the status of the archive was, and I cannot speak on what the status of the archive is today or the last 10 years because I have not been affiliated with the archive or the university. I've been working directly with survivors across Canada. Now, with regards to what project I'm currently working on and is directly related to the record sovereignty issue is that we are trying to find two boys that drowned in a pond that was located next to the Shinwalk Residential School. These boys died in 1915. We have testimony from a former staff member that was at the school that these boys did indeed died in that pond, and they're still there. The pond was filled in and eventually turned into a park in Sault Ste. Marie called Snowden Park. And we are trying to get records from the Canadian government that are over 100 years old, and they're saying no. They're under restricted access, and they won't allow us access to these records that will help identify these two boys. In the meantime, we try to find information about two girls that passed away at the Shinwalk Hospital that was located on the site. They were mentioned in the annual reports of the Department of Indian Affairs. They were a mystery. So, trying to find out two boys, we ran across 2 girls. So we had to find out who these 2 girls were. And after searching through the census records, I'm not sure, some of the researchers are using the census records because census takers did actually go around to each residential school and take the census of the students that were at that residential school. So the residential school census records, or records regarding residential schools, are in the census records. For 1921 that were just released, you can look up the name of the principal in your search engine who ran the school at the same time, and you'll come up with a page that will show you the name of the principal, his family, the name of the Indian agent sometimes, and all of the students that were at the school there. So you can get a snapshot on every 10-year period of the list of the students who are there. Now, the children of Shinwak alumni consider children who have not been identified as missing. We have a database of about 2,750 students that went to the Shinwak over that almost a 100-year period. And these records help to build that database of records. So if you know the people who were there, then you'll be able to help identify who may have passed away. Our battle with the Canadian government has been trying to get access to records that are part of the Indian Register and the Indian Trust Fund. The Indian Register is a record, is a compilation of all the names of all the First Nation people who were alive, every man, woman, and child since about the 1800s. Since 1951, they've created a database using the band list, but prior to that, they used the treaty and annuity lists that existed for the First Nations in order to compile that register. And we are trying to get access to the Indian Register for records of the annuities and treaty band lists that existed prior to 1920. Because we're looking at a period of 1910 and 1920, a 10-year period, in order to help identify these kids. The government says, no, you can't access these records. These records are over 100 years old, again. The treaty pay lists also, there were separate treaty pay lists for students who were at a residential school. The Indian agents fill these in, and we need to get our hands on these copies. But the Department of Indigenous Affairs or Indigenous, I've forgotten what these are. Anyway, they are adamant that they won't provide us with even an inventory of the records that they have. We know that these records exist because prior to 1907, there are copies of these records available at Library and Archives Canada. So they do exist. Separate treaty pay lists for students who are at a residential school. Now, the Indian Trust Fund. That is another nightmare that the government doesn't even want to go there with that. The reason why we want to access the Indian Trust Fund is because students who died at a residential school paid for their own funerals. Line items in the Indian Trust Fund ledger show that when a student died at a residential school, the coffin cost $6 during that time period. The gravedigger was paid $1. Now, the ledgers show that these monies were withdrawn by the Indian agent on behalf of the principal. You would go down the list of the First Nation if there was an indication of, one example was 3 kids died at the Shinwak and Wewanash residential schools in around 1905 or 6. There were 3 of them, 1 girl and 2 boys. They're buried in the Shinwak Cemetery. In the line item in the Indian Register for the account for the Walpole Island First Nation, there is the name of the principal with a line item that says coffins for Indians, $12, two coffins. So, the government has information about kids being buried because they paid for their own funerals. We are trying to follow the money. Now, the Indian Trust Fund also was used to pay the pensions of the Indian agents. Government money was never used to pay their pensions. They were withdrawn from the Indian Trust Fund. Principals' salaries were withdrawn out of the Indian Trust Fund. Books, desks, supplies, cleaning material, wood for the stove at Indian residential and day schools were all withdrawn out of the Indian Trust Fund. And I'm sorry to say that treaty money, it was also withdrawn out of the Indian Trust Fund. The Indians were paying themselves. I'm sorry to say. The Yellowhead Institute at former Ryerson University and now the Toronto Metropolitan University made a report about this years ago. The Indian Trust Fund was used to subsidize the residential school system. In other words, Indian children subsidize the residential school system. In other words, Indigenous people subsidize their own genocide. I'm sorry to say, but that's a fact. It's not my opinion. It's in the ledgers of the Indian Trust Fund. We're trying to get our hands on that information, but of course not. The government won't even respond to requests for information about the Indian Trust Fund. So anyway, the Indian Act gave the government that authority. Under the Indian Act, the Parliament gave the authority to withdraw money out of the annuity, to use the annuity payments of a child, to use the, if I can use the terminology, to use the annuity payments to help pay for the maintenance of a child at a residential school. And also, the Indian Act allowed the Indian agent to use, or the Indian Affairs Department to use that money to help pay for the maintenance of the residential school itself. So anyway, these are some of the records that you're going to be trying to get your hands on. I thought I would give you an idea of what you're looking at, and this is what you're going to be trying to, you're going to be uncovering, is that if you follow the money trail, I'm sorry to say, that is where the money went. Anyway, I know you're standing there. So. Anyway, thank you. I hope I was able to help you.
Thank you very much, Ed. That was great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ed. Edward Sadowski. Our last speaker on this panel, of course, is the head archivist at the NCTR. You will have heard Dr. Wilson in the keynote, in her keynote this morning, talk about the genesis of the NCR to the NCTR, and I'm aware that Mr. Frogner would speak to this, as well as to speak to some of the questions that were raised in relation to the NCTR, who we've heard something about already. So, with that.
Just wait for the slides. There you go. Tanse, Raymond Netigason, Notari Oscar Egua Ikari Doris, Netatoscan, National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Bonjour, je m'appelle Raymond, je suis le directeur pour les archives du Centre national pour la vérité et la réconciliation. Hi, my name is Raymond. I'm the archivist for the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. I wish to begin my talk by acknowledging this conference is being held on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I apologize for that pronunciation. As the head of archives for the NCTR, I work daily on records documenting the history and legacy of residential schools. I engage with Indigenous communities, religious groups, and various government offices on records concerning such topics as missing children, unmarked burial sites, and child wellness. I can say from experience, none of these groups agree on the meaning of Indigenous data sovereignty. This is because the concept is so complex. Under the Indian Act, the federal government has maintained such a high level of control and surveillance of Indigenous communities that it produces data on every component of a community's life. To understand how Indigenous communities can effectively assert their sovereignty over records of their own concern, we must consider the context of the records, how they were created, valued, stored, accessed, and used. Or, in the words of the First Nations Information Governance Center, when considering the knowledge and skills needed to support strong First Nations information governance, we start with the question, quote, what is your relationship to this information, unquote. In this talk, I will recognize this context with two examples: the NCTR survivor inquiries, which are the inquiries from survivors and relations for records of their residential school experience, and the records of the Oblate Order OMI Lacombe. From these examples, I will conclude with 5 recommendations on how Indigenous communities can assert sovereignty over records relevant to their investigations of residential schools and related burial sites, including how can they eventually acquire complete and total sovereignty and control over these records. So what do we mean by Indigenous data sovereignty, or IDS? IDS refers to the right of Indigenous peoples to govern the collection, ownership, and use of data about Indigenous communities, peoples, lands, and resources. There are 3 important details when considering how to assert IDS for records of residential schools and related burial sites. First, the concept of data sovereignty is very recent. It is defined as controlling information in response to the rules, laws, and customs of a particular jurisdiction or state. It is made possible by IT developments such as networked information in digital formats easily copied and shared. For years, data sovereignty has been the domain of governments and corporations, where it is used to assert governance and monetize information. It's important to recognize the residential school records we're dealing with are historical records stored in repositories and not currently in daily use. This has led to confusion over how to appraise their value and manage their use. There are many in the research community who continue to hold the mistaken idea that historical records are less sensitive and potentially harmful. This is fundamentally wrong. For this reason, the NCTR in fact created an academic access committee to ensure that NCTR archival records were being used with the ethical goals of respect, dignity, and welfare of the subjects contained in the records. I would suggest we need something similar on a regional national level for the investigation into unmarked burial sites. Second, data sovereignty is the assertion of control over records within a particular jurisdiction. The statutes, rules, and legislation that guide the use of data is largely determined within the relevant state. Transferring control over data to Indigenous communities within an identified state creates overlapping and often conflicting spheres of jurisdiction. The nature of this jurisdiction and the coexistence of rival authorities is one of the most pressing issues in implementing IDS for residential school records. There are no laws or legislation, provincial or federal, concerning the jurisdiction over unmarked burial sites related to residential schools. Similarly, I've had many conversations with elders representing various communities across the country who tell me that there simply is no formal protocols, traditions, and customs for dealing with mass grave sites. This is something that is a relatively, unfortunately, a relatively new phenomenon. And this is why we have a special interlocutor. Finally, Indigenous research data on burial sites is generated or held within Indigenous communities and organizations through band councils, elders, knowledge keepers, designated research authorities, NGOs, research institutions, and commercial entities. Who should hold responsibility to assert the long-term control over this information? The residential school system acted as a solvent that dissolved the bonds of Indigenous community. It is not always clear where to locate the authority to perform these research and knowledge-keeping tasks for such sensitive information. And I'm aware now that I'm on a really tight timeline, so I'm going to try and race through a couple of these slides with the advice that all of this is fully available to anyone who wants it later. I will pass on my notes and my slides, so if I go too fast for the next couple of slides, it's only for the purpose of having a discussion later. Talking about colonial sovereignty, where do we begin? We have to begin with how these colonial archives were constituted in the first place, because this is where we're getting our records from. So if we wish communities to assert data sovereignty over archival records, we have to understand what we mean by colonial archives. Understanding the origins of these records makes it possible to assert another kind of sovereignty in another kind of context. From the end of the 19th and throughout the 20th century, there was a kind of colonial common law that asserted sovereignty, settler sovereignty over the rights and title of Indigenous peoples. Some examples include the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which promised rights and title for Indigenous peoples, but never actually followed through on that. The BC Lands Acquisition Act of 1861, which did not permit fee simple land title to Indigenous peoples in British Columbia, and the Indian Advancement Act of 1891, which removed the right of Indigenous peoples to have a vote, and that was held back until 1961. These are just some examples of colonial sovereignty asserting its authority and having as a result a residue or a kind of a resulting colonial archival network that was created, enshrining cultural, legal, and spiritual authority. The result, just to give you again, I'm going to do this quickly, is a couple examples of law that was based on these colonial archives. Calder v. the Attorney General of British Columbia, everyone knows the Calder trial, was actually included in the state's argument. 9 colonial proclamations and 4 land ordinances, all kept in the BC archives, colonial documents that were used for this land title case. Our Edward Gosnell versus the Ministry of Lands is actually the first provincial archivist of British Columbia using his knowledge of documentary process to try and claim lands from the Malahat Reserve after they'd already been designated as lands of the Malahat peoples. He took it all the way to the Supreme Court before he lost his case. But nevertheless, he built it off of the colonial records that were kept at the archives. And finally, the Cowichan petition of 1909, which represents the first time colonial peoples actually made a formal assertion of their title within the framework of the colonial law. These examples also show us that for several generations, common law was the only venue for Indigenous peoples to represent their claims for rights and title. In fact, Indigenous law and governance practices never went away, they were simply not recognized. And as we've heard last night in Grand Chief Stephen Point's talk, this has significantly changed. Part of our challenge to implement IDS is putting in place a method to respectfully recognize this legal coexistence between the state and Indigenous communities. We need to find methods to meaningfully relate Indigenous law and state law without demeaning the local laws. Otherwise, the reconciliation process will be imagined entirely within state law. In effect, this is Article 27 of the UNDRIP, or the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which asks for a recognition of Indigenous legal practice. But we have to consider local context rather than the UNDRIP to find a way to deal with IDS. To move out of the orbit of state law, we need to find a way to bring legal weight to non-Western values of family, homeland, and belonging, expressed through community laws and practices concerning marriage, death, naming, sexuality, kinship ties, spiritual practices, and domestic relations. Because these are the topics that are covered in residential school records, the religious journals, the teachers' reports, and the hospital records. We need to understand how to recognize and share with respect these records that document very intimate, personal, and very human and often hurtful school experiences. To take legal practice out of the state, and including its legislation. And this is the basic challenge and the social problem of law. How, despite our diversity, can we come to working solutions that allow us to live together despite our continuing disagreements? I now want to turn to a couple of examples, as I mentioned in my introduction, the first being survivor inquiries. The survivor inquiries are requests made by a residential school survivor or family member to acquire all the records of his or her experience at a residential school or schools. It is NCTR policy to supply on request a comprehensive dossier of every record we hold on a survivor's experience of the residential school program. At times there are no records, other times there are thousands. It is important to understand this is a dossier of the students' experiences brought together from operational administrative records of a particular school. We have to do research and pull together records from religious orders, provincial government offices, federal government bureaus, hospitals, and police administrations, just to name a few sources. The origins, it should be noted, of these records is not the life of the child, but rather the operation of the school. And finally, it has to be pointed out that the records, before they can be sent to the family or the individual survivor that has requested them, have to be vetted through Manitoba's Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. This is not our choice. This is under the NCTR Act, which I'll get to in a moment. So just to give you a brief rundown then, in 2018, we completed 82 individual inquiries without a significant backlog. By then, we've been in operation for a little over 2 years. In 2020, we completed 210 inquiries, and that year, we logged 166 new inquiries. In the spring of 2021, we witnessed the discovery of burial sites and an explosion in inquiries. That year, we logged 460 individual inquiries and completed 134. This year saw a 175% increase in survivor inquiries. The important takeaway is not that the burial sites issue caused a spike in inquiries. Indigenous peoples have always had a tremendous concern for the impact the residential schools program has had on their lives. The point of this example is that we're now entering a period in a colonial relationship between Indigenous peoples and settler communities when we're building mechanisms to address the issues of data sovereignty on terms written by Indigenous communities. For the principle of IDS to succeed, there must be more processes and capacities to enable communities to implement control over this data. And I was interested to hear this morning, Kim Marie referred to, actually I think it was Dr. Marie Wilson, the fragments of records that were pulled together from such a diversity of sources. The TRC did a tremendous amount of this work, but the NCTR has continued this development. We now have over 104 different religious repository record sets, 47 government repository sets. This year, we'll be acquiring the Common Experience payment records, as well as the day school records. And we're currently working on acquiring the records of the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry. So these are significant record sets that we continue to acquire. But it should be noted when Dawn is raising the issue of what do we mean by Indigenous archives, this is all new and unprecedented. We're pulling together records from a completely heterogeneous environment and trying to bring them together over the principles of documenting residential school experiences in the lives of Indigenous children that were there. And now I'd like to turn to further collection development, this time our relationship with the Oblates of OMI Lacombe. I'll begin by just pointing out it was in 1991, in front of media and an audience of about 20,000 Indigenous peoples, attending the Lac St. Anne annual pilgrimage, that the president of the Oblate Superiors, Reverend Douglas Crosby, expressed a formal apology that's now preserved at the NCTR archives. He apologized for the existence of the schools, the cultural erasure, the physical and emotional trauma, and the attempted assimilation. And in his apology, he promised to support an effective process of disclosure of Oblate residential school records, 1991. We offered, as he said, we offered to collaborate in any way we can so that the full story of the residential schools may be written. Over 20 years later now, we continue, over 30 years later now, we continue to struggle to create this process. However, it should be pointed out, after the discoveries of burial sites in 2021, we were able to finally strike an agreement with the Oblate Order of OMI Lacombe to make us the principal repository of all the records they hold that document the operation of Oblate-run schools. This includes the codexes, which it should be pointed out just recently by a series of denier posts and media releases claimed that we had them long ago, but we were holding them back. We never did have them until just recently. So we're now getting, and the Oblate's records in general, we're now getting the lion's share of everything that they had regarding these schools. It's always going to be difficult to say that we have absolutely everything because we don't have a register of all the records that they actually hold. So we're signing an agreement that's telling us that they have produced everything that they hold on the operations of these schools, and it's a legal agreement. So, I mean, I don't know how much further we can go with it, but I think it's a significant step forward. The one caveat is that we're still waiting for them to agree on releasing all of their personnel files. That's the one set of records that they have not fully released to us yet, and we're still working on that, or waiting for that. And this is just an example of the scattered nature of the records. As you can see, and this is just for the Oblates OMI Lacombe, we've been working with all of these different repositories to pull in the records. The Provincial Archives of Alberta, the Société Historique de St. Boniface, the Royal BC Museum and Archives, the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Vancouver, et cetera, et cetera. So it's in a tremendously dispersed set of records that we're pulling together. And we know there's more than these repositories. There's even more out there that we're still trying to track down. But at the end of the day, what we have is an unprecedented collection of records that document the operations and administrations of these schools that had never been done before. And we're continuing to develop it as time goes on. So now, turning to the recommendations, just 5 thoughts on how we can apply Indigenous data sovereignty to the records that I just discussed with you. And first and foremost, a collection or an Indigenous Research Council or a cultural commons. I've had several elders tell me directly they do not want their band council or any appointed researcher to be able to see their school records whatsoever. I've also had several researchers ask me for all the school records of a particular school, to which I always point out that there are often more than 40 different communities that send children to a particular school. That's hundreds of individual families, and the records document some very disturbing events in the life of a child. When I ask how that information will be released to the community, they've always responded that they will create a general trust, which I think is great. But that's the kind of idea that I think we need to expand on in the special interlocutors work, making available records of unmarked burial sites and residential schools in general. I think there needs to be a set of regional councils that can coordinate the distribution of these sensitive records, so that they're not duplicated, so not every community has the same set of school records. And that also to ensure that families are not seeing the records of their lost loved ones publicly released into the community without any control whatsoever. I think this kind of a council or a commons could oversee this kind of distribution of records, and it could also assert things such as copyright over the records as well. At the moment, traditional cultural expressions of valued records from communities really don't have any protection outside of individual property rights in copyright. What would be nice is that if we had a council like this that would recognize items of traditional cultural experience that have enduring value for communities, and then have those protected by this council, so that rather than having an individual person selling a copyright of a traditional cultural expression, there could be a council that could manage this kind of thing. So I think this council would have would resolve a lot of the issues that we're encountering at the moment for distributing very sensitive records. The second recommendation is research repositories. The NCTR is creating a series of research repositories for digital records that communities are creating as they're doing their unmarked burial research. This is free of charge, and it eliminates from communities the difficult task of setting up servers, administrating the servers, the costs of upgrades, systems administration in general. It also has a high volume storage capacity, so communities could concentrate on the research that really matters, and rather than having to worry about the systems administration of it. Just to give you a couple examples of why we've discovered this is a good idea, and this raises the capacity of communities to do the research. I won't say the community, but we did, in one example, send over 2,000 records to a community, and unfortunately they didn't have a storage repository, and the records were promptly lost when their laptop crashed. Fortunately, we held master copies and we were able to send another copy, but this is just an example of why we think these kind of research repositories would be a good idea to assist communities as they do their research going forward. I know I'm starting to run out of time, so this just is one snapshot of the Six Nations of the Grand River Elected Council repository. We have over 25 that are in the process of being set up at the moment. Another recommendation, I just have a couple more. The TRC, in their final report, did not write a lot about Indigenous community colleges, but there are several successful Indigenous community colleges out there. Blue Quills, Masquachese, Old Sun. I think this could be at least an example in some cases of a kind of bricks and mortar site where there could be a set of conscience built, an archives could be constructed where the records could be kept. There is kind of already there as a cultural center that could be used as a repository for these records. Again, these are just recommendations, not nothing that needs to necessarily be followed. And number 4, the NCTR recently received a $6 million grant, and one of the projects that the grant is going to fund is data management workshops. We want to offer free workshops to any communities that are interested in working with digital records and the best practices behind them: storage, access, description of the records, reproduction, transfer, all the activities that go around the best management of digital records. This would be free, and we're currently just putting together the curriculum or the workshops. I see these as beginner, intermediate, and advanced, and cover everything from working with Excel to downloading records from our website. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, redraft the NCTR Act. The NCTR Act was written to place the NCTR under a privacy legislation because the TRC was working with federal ATIP, and when the records were transferred over to the auspices of the University of Manitoba, there was no legislation to control sensitive records. So the NCTR placed the NCTR strictly under Manitoba's Freedom of Information Protection Privacy Act. And just to give you some examples, Article 2 of the Act says the purpose of the Act is to set out the access and privacy laws that apply to the center. There's no mention whatsoever of community laws. It just says this is the phrase that's being used. Article 3, the record shall be accessible in accordance with access and privacy legislation. Article 4, FIPA applies to all all center records. Article 4.2, for clarity, records are not exempt from FIPA. So again and again and again, the NCTR places us within the confines of this legislation without ever mentioning Indigenous laws, Indigenous knowledge models, or any other method of controlling privacy, making sure that the records are handled with dignity, respect. There are other examples. There's Ronnie Orlinker principles, the UNDRIP, the Organization of American States, which also has comments on Indigenous rights. These could all be incorporated into a new draft of the NCTR Act that brings Indigenous values into the management of the records. Because for now, when we're making the records available and we want to open up all of the records for this research, the one way we found to get around it, according to legal counsel, is to draft a memorandum of understanding. It's onerous, it's difficult, it's time-consuming, and it's extremely colonial. But this is the corner that we've been painted into by the NCTR Act, and until it's redrafted, I don't see any other way that we can possibly make these records fully available for communities to use in their research.
Raymond, that was a lot of information that you condensed for us very quickly. I appreciate that. We have cut into participants' time, so I am going to go ahead and immediately open up the microphones so that you folks can get the information that you seek from the panel. So let's turn immediately to this right here. We have Councillor Jeanette Jules.
Former councillor.
Former councillor, pardon me.
So when the 215 first happened, I was involved as the councillor portfolio, as a knowledge keeper, as a traditional, cultural, spiritual person. I've been a pipe carrier for over 45 years. I started going up on the mountain when I was 8 years old. My grandparents chose me and my younger sister to do that. And so when you talk about data sovereignty, intellectual proprietary, I've been just busy writing notes here for the last 3 days. I'm going to state something that my dad always stated. When the Union of BC Indian Chiefs was being formed and the National Indian Brotherhood was being formed, I had the opportunity of listening to the greatest orators our country ever had. And we would go to Nisqually to sit in my uncle George Manuel's house, up to Skeetcheston to listen to my uncle Charlie Draney, up to the North Thompson Indian Band, seemed to listen to my Uncle Wilfred Matthew, and my dad. The biggest thing all of them stated was occupy the field. So the message that I'm stating to everybody in this room is we need to occupy the field, develop our own laws, standards, with our own customs, beliefs, traditions. That is what we need to do. Never mind about what the government of Canada, the government of British Columbia, or anybody else is stating. When it comes to intellectual proprietary and copyright, the biggest example is the stories of our Shuswap stories of Isaac Willard, who's my grandmother's older brother, Amy August, my Grandpa Ike's sister-in-law, Charlie Draney, who is my Aunt May's, my dad's older sister's husband. They gave their tellings of our Stetlahem, our truths, and of our spectaculars. Randy Bouchard had come to the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. We had the First Citizen Fund, and the only way he could access that was by going to the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. So when you talk about intellectual proprietary and copyright, I think the Swapam kind of led that piece in that, where they copyrighted and said you couldn't access anything, except it changed with the Swapam Cultural Education Society versus, or Randy Bouchard versus the Swapam Cultural Education Society, where Rita Matthew, at the time she was Rita Jack, and my younger sister Frida were taken to court. And the judge ruled at that time, you cannot take what is embedded in somebody's mind and copyright that. They wrote our stories through the memory of what they were told, what we were raised with. So that makes a huge difference. And then when you look at Bill C-41, which is BC, and then you look at Bill C-15, which is Canada, and that looks at the legislation of UNDRIP and supporting the principles. I know that's what the legalese for the province like to state. But all of these are internationally recognized standards, laws that are there that look after our rights, and we have to take a look at that. So I'm just going to read one statement that I, because of all of these things, helped develop. And then you have to take a look at the Hovasapi, where the University of Arizona copyrighted the DNA of the people down there, and it took them 25 years to get the copyright to their own DNA, people's own DNA back. They had to go through every single court in the United States. So Indigenous intellectual copyright is protected under international law and standards. This report, and so this is what we always put as a statement, this report and the information presented in it are the physical and intellectual property and protection of the Tk'emlúps and the individuals who shared their knowledge for the purpose of whatever the report is going to be. And the individuals have shared their knowledge. TTS retains ownership of this information in perpetuity. Nothing in this report can be reproduced or distributed in whole or in part without the written permission of the TTS Chief and Council, and it could be whatever organization that you are. The report is a living document intended for the use of TTS for the purpose of reviewing the Lesqueque and the missing and related to anything studies that are to be done, and represented the fully documented or articulated culture and heritage of Tk'emlúps to Secwepemc. And anybody that works with us has to sign a statement of research and information sharing protocol. And one of the biggest things I think we need to take a look at is which isn't out there, is that we need to review the code of ethics that the universities are under. So that brings to task the National Truth and Reconciliation. I just read some of the parts that was given to access information, and it's housed with the University of Winnipeg or the University of Manitoba. And AFN, or the National Indian Brotherhood Trust Fund, has to explain how did that happen? Who gave the authority for all of our information to be housed in a university? So, you know, I got nothing against universities. It's done a lot of things for a lot of people, but they shouldn't have to be, and we shouldn't have to be going by a lot of they have to go by what our standards are. So that's the biggest piece that I see that we need to be taking a look at, and all of the archival research that needs to be done. That's my statement on this. Your East Jokes.
Thank you very much for that. Anybody want to speak to that? Thank you very much for that, for your statement, Jeanette. Yes. You could just identify yourself for the mic, please.
My name is Victor Martin. I'm with the Akwesasne Survivors Group. A suggestion on getting the religious orders and the other groups to open up with their information. Would it be possible to have a MOU signed with each religious order? Maybe that way they know where you stand and you know where they stand, and there's an agreement beforehand on what's going to be done with the information. And secondly, a second suggestion would be to have a neutral third party deal with both sides. In court cases in the U.S., they a lot of times deal with a neutral third party when there's information that to be dealt with or records. They a lot of times assign a neutral third party. So those two suggestions might be a way. Because if you sign an MOU with the oblate order, and then information started flowing, other religious orders might see that this was done, and they might follow the same path. Because I get the impression that a lot of the religious orders and groups are hesitant to open up their records. So maybe an MOU would be the diplomatic way to go about it. Just a suggestion.
Thank you for that. Raymond, do you want to speak to that?
Even better. Okay. The reason we signed our agreement with the Oblates was maybe twofold. One, the TRC wasn't able to get much out of them. Partly, they fell back on the argument that it was unclear. The mandate, the Schedule N that set up the TRC and gave them the mandate to collect the records said acquire as complete as possible a record of this history from all these different sources. And that was constantly a stumbling block. What exactly does that mean? So as I said, following the discoveries and the spotlight being cast on them, the Oblates suddenly opened up to this concept of turning over the records, including their codices and all their other files. And that's when we were able to sign an MOU with them. For example, with the Protestant orders, we were pretty successful in acquiring the records from them. But there still remains, the Catholics ran 60% of the residential schools, and it's those orders that I think we would still need to have agreements with to really, legally enshrine the fact that they need to have, to make available their records for us. And I forget what the other...
Second part of your question was whether or not there would be an independent or could be an independent third party to be involved in litigation matters?
Well, yeah, in obtaining the records, just having a third party.
In terms of obtaining records, and that might be more connected to the regional councils.
Yeah,
that perhaps
exactly.
You
Yeah,
suggested?
that's kind of what I'm sort of suggesting with these regional councils, that if you could have, within a region, a collection of communities that could come together and coordinate their argument for acquiring the records, making sure the distribution is done in a sensitive way for the families, that sort of thing. And it would also include, for example, if there's any kind of legal action that needs to be taken, that the council could represent them. Mm-hmm. I think that's a good idea.
Like, say, one primary aspect of an MOU might say that the records are just going to be used for healing purposes of a certain community, that type of thing. and any other purposes that would be outside that definition. Like that kind of MOU might be more something that would open up things more.
Yeah, I mean, definitely education is one of the principal reasons we would have that. I mean, but it would also include arguments for rights and those kinds of issues as well.
Thank you.
All right, thank you for that. We'll go to this microphone next, and then your question, sir.
Sigamanak, Gobel Wilson. For some reason, I started off with women. But in my culture, when we introduce ourselves, when we go into a feast, we address the men and the women and the children. And one of the things that my elders have taught me was to stand in front of people without feeling fear, without feeling anything that would hold me back. And that was a lot of training that I had to reclaim back from Indian day school, from the people that came from residential school. It really, to see the effects that has happened to our people, and to see that the media finally starting to address all of this, like we were not human. And we are. And I recognize the fact that the children in the Gitxsan law, in all First Nation laws, the number one law is not to harm a child. And that's exactly what the government did, was took our children away. And for us to rebuild and reconnect and come back to our culture, we have to do it just as that lady has spoken, our way, our culture, because that's the one who kept us strong. That's the one who kept us resilient. To stand up and be strong, to see my grandparents, my grandmother, my grandfather, they fought the Dalgamouth court case. And I'm thankful that through them pushing me forward to use my voice, because they had to fight for that. Each one of us had to fight for that. And I want to do the same thing for my children. A lady told me, they were talking about acknowledging the children. We all have our ways of different nations. And she recommended to have a memorial place in each community where the lost children that were not claimed, to put on that memorial, because we don't have a place to go to mourn our lost ones. Because they're, you know what you're talking about today, data. You know, the government is hiding all of this information. My husband was a foster kid. When he got his whole big list of everything that the government did, half of it was blacked out because he was abused, almost killed. And that needs to be put forward. You know that we all went through something. But I'm thankful for our ancestors. I'm thankful for my grandparents. I just want to put my hands up to everybody. Just, Amia, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm from the Gitxsan Nation. My name's Carol Louie, but everybody knows me as Carrie. Amia.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Louie.
Ani Bojo, Nawabagi Jig Dijnikaz, get the Ganzi Bionjba, Namedo Dem, Anishnabe, Minoa Mashke Gondao. Good afternoon, everybody. Chief Andy Ricker, Gardner First Nation in Ontario here. And I guess I first wanted to acknowledge some of our sacred items here at the front. I also want to acknowledge our brothers and sisters out here to welcome us here in this traditional territory. And I also want to acknowledge our survivors here as well. I've been to the last 2 sessions, both in Edmonton and Winnipeg, and it's been a very humbling experience just to hear the stories of our elders, to have the resiliency and the strength to tell their stories, no matter how hard it has been for them. I guess there's a few comments I wanted to make, maybe not so much questions, but you know, there's some concerns, I guess, from where I standpoint, in terms of the position that I have as the chief within my community. So I know Mr. Sadowski spoke about Shingwak Residential School, and that's in our traditional territory. Actually, we have 2 direct lineages to Chief Shingwak. It's his great-great-granddaughter. I'm going to get up to get her to wave, and her great-great-grandson as well, which is the school that was situated in Sault Ste. Marie. And I know that you brought up a good point there, Ed, about follow the money, right? And I think that's very important. And I've heard this loud and clear from our members, especially from my community, the families, the elders, survivors, our colleagues within my community. But I think it's very important to note, and it also brought up a good point with Elder Cardinal this morning, who spoke about, you know, some of the individuals, consultants that are capitalize on the backs of our survivors, their story, their pain, the work, the words that were shared just a moment ago about university. And I want to speak to that about education institutions again, because it's something that we recognize within our community about the pain and suffering. And again, education institutions capitalizing on the backs and pain and suffering of our people to cushion their funding for development, to cushion their funding for whatever they need in terms of their institutions. And that really kind of irks our people within our community, our survivors, our elders, when that happens, right? And it's something that needs to be acknowledged. It's our truth that we recognize, and I think that's something that I wanted to come to the mic to let all of our communities know that as well, is that we have to be very leery of sometimes of education institutions, and sometimes we just got to call it out the way it is, even though it's tough, it's uncomfortable. But we've been being capitalized for far too long, since time immemorial, where people are taking advantage of us. And I think this needs to be shared over and over and over again. Because as soon as money is announced for our people, our communities, our nations, our survivors, you have consultants rush to our communities, making a quick buck off of our pain and suffering. And as a leader here, I'm tired of it. I'm tired of it. I'm tired of education institutions capitalizing on. I'm tired of consultants. I'm tired of hearing the pain and suffering of our elders. We're losing that alarming rate, but we have people capitalizing on that. I don't like that, and I think it just needs to be said over and over again. I know within our community, I think, you know, when we talk about, you know, survivors and we talk about communities and all those kinds of things, I think what is happening back in my community is that we're an afterthought. Garden River First Nation, our community is an afterthought. I just introduced 2 members of Shingwak Residential School who direct lineage to Chief Shingwak, who the school was named after, but yet we're an afterthought in terms of the work that happens, in terms of the recovery around those areas. And I think that's something that, you know, bothers us as leaders, is because we want to be respectful of the process, we want to be respectful of the survivors, but we also hear loud and clear from our families, from our survivors within our own community, right? And I think this is something that has happened elsewhere in Canada as well. And I want to just extend, you know, I guess, an invitation to have a conversation about some of those challenges, because it's difficult. It's difficult because you don't want to get in the way of moving forward in a good way or doing some of that difficult work. But at the same time, sometimes those hard truths need to be spoken. And I just felt that I needed to get up here and share some of those words on behalf of our community, because wouldn't be doing my people justice if I just allowed the conversation to continue on. So I just wanted to kind of bring that to the attention of the forum here, because I think it needs to be stated over and over again, because we're continuously being, you know, taken advantage of. And I see this still to this day. We might not see it front and center, but systematically it is happening in terms of funding, in terms of cushioning the support of education institutions and other places like that, right? So on behalf of my people, I just want to say miigwech again. Thank you for the organizers. Thank you for the communities for hosting us graciously. And I just wanted to speak our truth from our community. Miigwech.
Thank you very much for that, Chief. Thank you, Chief. We have run out of time. I do know what it feels like to have someone creep up on you and off the mic, so I apologize to these folks. I've done it to them. But help me out here in thanking the panel on this very important subject.
Thank you to the panel. Thank you, Don. Thank you, Treaty Commissioner Culverson, for allowing me to put you first on the next speakers list. Another gentleman who wants to speak but isn't here tomorrow. I apologize. We have to find a way to move on.